Okay, what I'm going to do is just quickly introduce our two speakers this evening. We have Brian O'Donoghue with us in person. We have Andrew Kitchenman online. I'll introduce both of them. I'll turn it over to Brian to talk with us for a bit. We'll move on to Andrew, and then we'll do like a collective Q&A. So think of questions and comments as they speak. Brian O'Donoghue is past president of the Alaska Press Club, longtime member of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Organization, and professor of journalism emeritus here at University of Alaska Fairbanks. He holds a journalism master's degree from NYU, lured to North in 1986 by a want ad for the twice-weekly Frontiersman in Wasilla. His appreciation for Alaska's beauty and diverse cultures broadened through career moves to the Fairbanks Daily Newsminer, the Anchorage Daily News, KTVF, and KTDA TV. For each, he covered breaking news locally and reported from Juneau during legislative sessions. In fall of '01, O'Donoghue was recruited to teach journalism here at UAF. Over the course of a decade-long rolling investigation, O'Donoghue and his undergrad students through the so-called Fairbanks Four, which we'll talk with us a bit about tonight. The Fairbanks Four are a Native group wrongfully convicted of a younger white teen's 1997 murder. His books include My Lead Dog Was a Lesbian, Honest Dogs, and the Fairbanks Four, Murder, Injustice, and the Birth of a Movement. He's married to Kate Ripley, who has been on staff here at the university, who he tells me bonded over politics and sled dog races, and their three children, Rory, Robin, and Rachel, can testify to that result. So that is Brian. I'm going to introduce Andrew, who is online with us. Andrew Kitchenman has covered state government in Alaska since 2016, serving as the Capitol reporter for Alaska Public Media and KTOO before joining the Alaska Beacon. Before this, he covered state and local governments on the East Coast, primarily in New Jersey, for more than 15 years. He enjoys reading, watching movies, and walking around Anchorage. So we're delighted to have Brian and Andrew with us tonight in this chapter of our Arctic Leadership Lecture Series, Media in the Arctic. So Brian, take it away.
Sure. Let me emphasize the Beacon is one of the best sources of news in Alaska, and is just a really good operation, and something if you care about good news coverage is worth checking out. Okay, I'm an old news hound. I've always loved chasing the news, getting answers from people, victims, folks that have suffered some sort of unexpected situation. And I originally, my aspirations were to become a roving news photographer. And in pursuing that, I ran across another old news hound at the time, and he told me that to be successful as a photojournalist, I should go somewhere miserable and newsworthy. And I kicked around Europe for a little while and eventually landed in Egypt, which proved to be miserable and newsworthy. At the time, it was peace talks going on between Anwar Sadat and the former Israeli general, with the eye patch, Moshe Dayan. And I covered that on an ongoing basis, and my pictures were circulated all over the place. About that time, though, my father suffered a stroke, which is just a reminder that life can cause really sudden changes on you. And I flew home, and he was just completely reduced to just barely able to sort of lift his head, and died shortly afterwards. And, that's the kind of thing. I mean, I think I was 23 years old or something. And that kind of thing changes your whole world, and so you just never know what's coming, and you got to make good use of your time. Anyway, I had come to the conclusion that pictures sold better with words That was sort of a lesson I had learned. And so I found myself writing more and more in terms of extensive cut lines. And one thing led to another. And I pretty much became a reporter first and a photographer second, took my own pictures, but the bulk of my time was spent interviewing and reporting. And I worked for a whole bunch of different weeklies. City paper in Washington and Baltimore, The Villager in New York, which I really had a good time on the Lower East Side. And then out of the blue, I was a little sick of the city. I had a situation involving police and a motorcycle, and basically lost my driver's license for a while. And the Frontiersman Want ad in Wasilla, Alaska was pretty interesting. And so boom, I jumped up here to the Frontiersman. And meanwhile, I was able to just walk right in and get a driver's license again. Just the states didn't have the kind of communication back then that would let anyone verify anything at any distance. So I benefited from that for sure. Because in Alaska, it's pretty hard to get around on a motorcycle and or without any kind of like actual public, any kind of just relying on public transportation. Anyway, as he mentioned, up here, I worked for a lot of different news organizations, including, I kept coming back to the Newsminer. And one of the lessons in that on a personal basis is, they always talk about the loyal employee that works somewhere for 10 years. That person is not rewarded as a general rule. By switching jobs, getting new jobs, each person who hires you is kind of invested in seeing that you're going to succeed. And you advance and you just keep advancing. And you never go from one job to a lesser paying job. Almost always, whatever salary you're collecting is going to increase as you make career moves. Okay, just keep that in mind. But anyway, now this is about leadership today. And that first whole section of my working life, I don't think leadership factored in any way in particular. I mean, we'd fight to chase a story, but what's the leadership in that? It's all self-serving, personal sort of personal achievement. But leadership, this talk has caused me to think about this a lot. And that really came, I think, in the way that a fluke left me teaching here at the university. And there was a job opening in the journalism department. Charles Mason, the chair then and the chair now again, was aware that I had a graduate degree, which was the minimum kind of level to get into actually teaching position here at UAF at the time anyway. And so I ended up teaching journalism. And one of the things at the last place I had worked, where I was editorial page editor at the Newsminer, is I was getting a lot of letters from a villager who kept complaining about the Hartman murder case. And how many have ever heard of John Hartman's murder or a group known as the Fairbanks Four? I see a lot of hands raised for the Fairbanks Four. John Hartman is the kid that was murdered. He was 14 years old, left for dead downtown, stomped in the head. And in a rush to justice that followed, the police rounded up a couple kids from the native school. And we used to have a native high school back then. It was called Howard Luke Academy. I think it might have even been not just high school, but like have more. And 3 of them were native kids, Athabascans, and they had a white friend, but all of them attended Howard Luke Academy. And in the kind of rush to justice, the police swept up two of them who were just downtown drunk. And one of them, Eugene Vent, was 17 years old, and he was interrogated for 8 hours on and off. And by the time it was done, he confessed to being part of John Hartman's murder. Okay, and again, appreciate he was completely drunk. And at a certain point in the interrogations, and we eventually got the recordings and all the rest of that, he said, like, it was a comment, something like, if I was there, I must have been involved, or I don't remember exactly the phrase, but it's like he suddenly acknowledged what the police kept telling him as being true. And that is a whole lesson in false confessions. And in the course of this case, we learned more and more and more about what can lead to false confessions. And plus, we were working hard, and this is first with my investigative reporting class, because another one of the things that was great about teaching at UAF is I'd always liked kind of like really digging for the news, but I didn't have any like specific training in that. And the UAF wanted you to go to a conference. You know, you're a professor here now. They want you to go to a conference. They sent me to something called Investigative Reporters and Editors, which is like the top investigative reporters kind of group in America. And I started going there year after year, talking to Pulitzer Prize winners and others, and really picking up a lot of information about, you know, there was folks that were all sorts of experts about working in big cities, you know, and dealing with these sort of things, and false confessions and all the rest of that. And anyway, this was 2001 when I started teaching here at UAF. Within 3 years, my students and I had just looked at every aspect of this case and had not found any proof that the 4 guys locked up had anything to do with this white kid's murder. Just nothing. I mean, just not a shred of tangible evidence. In a beating death, there should be all sorts of you know, if kids are arrested right away after taking part in a beating death, they're going to have some sort of scientific type, you know, things that tie them to the victim. And just all sorts of aspects of this were just led nowhere. So at that point, I sent my students out to interview jurors. And these are UAF undergraduates, and they were incredibly diligent. And they interviewed the jurors in this case. And what we discovered was that the jurors, unbeknownst to the prosecutors or anyone else, had gone outside, left the courthouse, and paced off what they had heard was the distance between John Hartman and you know, the one guy who claimed to have seen the murder, Arlo Olson, another native man, but he was downtown, and the police, you know, brought him in and questioned him, and one thing led to another. And Arlo Olson, who was a very nice guy, and I interviewed very many times, had basically been persuaded that he was doing the right thing by identifying these guys. Okay, and the jury, trying to figure this out, and this is a crime, a murder that occurred at dark, at night, 400 some feet away from where the crime occurred. Someone supposedly witnessed something happening, and so they paced off whatever distance that they thought was adequate, and conducted this test outside, because they'd been let out of the courthouse, and they just, the police just thought that the court the court sort of monitors just thought that they wanted to get some fresh air. And anyway, what they did was something that is completely against our legal system in terms of what can happen to jurors during deliberations. And the long and short of it was the first story that we did was called Experts, Jurors Erred in Murder Case. And this was published in my old paper, the Daily News Miner on Sunday in 2003. And no, yeah, it's March 2003. And anyway, this reopened that case. This story that we did reopened that case. And at that point, there was a couple years of arguments about whether or not what the jurors did mattered and this and that. It still all was ignoring the whole point that like there was no evidence linking the four to the case. And anyway, this is where it gets crazy. Year after year, we kept picking away at this case. And after about 7 years, there was nothing tying them to the crime. There was all sorts of, we had determined that Marvin Roberts, the kid with the car, the only one in that group that owned a car, and you had to have a car to make this work, had alibis, good alibis, multiple people. He was the kid who gave other kids rides. And that night he had given rides to all sorts of different people who came forward and told police about this, and police ignored it. Fairbanks Police Department, and having been a reporter at the News Miner, it was an awful police department back then. I mean, I could go on at length about something called the evidence locker scandal, but basically what it boiled down to is all the sort of valuable evidence of any sort, a brooch, this or that, pieces of gold, was locked up at the Fairbanks Police Department and then suddenly vanished. Okay. And the investigation done, I think, by the troopers looking into this, concluded that the only final step would be to interrogate the police chief, and he refused, and the case stopped there. His name was Pullis, the police chief. And anyway, I mean, it was pretty clear somebody in the police department had stolen the valuable things in the evidence locker. That was the kind of reputation the Fairbanks police had at the time. I mean, they're just, troopers were viewed as competent. The local police were not. Anyway, in 2008, I persuaded the News Miner to publish a 7-part series, the longest thing ever published in the News Miner, that basically laid out the case for there's no evidence against them. Why are they still in jail? And by that point, there had been a growing movement within initially Native circles to, let me see if I can make this thing work. Can you guys see? Okay, what was the?
Your slides here?
Yeah, can I show some slides?
This one, you should be able to do it.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yep.
I'm looking at I'm looking at my, at one computer, not the other. Okay, this is George Freeze, the first person that was picked up, was just interrogated, had been drunk at the time, and this is later in a court proceeding where he was given his own sort of perspective on things, brought in and out in chains, just part of the whole thing. This reflects the day that Marvin Roberts was released. Marvin Roberts had served his full time. He served 18 years in prison. He was out on parole, and the Native community at this point had firmly determined that he and the others were innocent. And who has just heard the news about Marvin Roberts? In the back. What was it? Yeah. $11.5 million. State of Alaska still has not acknowledged that it did anything wrong, but he just got now, more than 20 years later, a settlement for $11 million. And that, in a way, is a huge marker of, earlier, the other three got settlements of $1.5 million each. That was came through the city's insurance policy. This one is more of the result of a long-running legal argument that was going to be decided in his favor. And I think the $11 million really punctuates how screwed up this whole case was. But anyway, leadership, talking about leadership, as an independent working journalist, I pretty much looked out for myself. I was accused of, stealing other people's stories sometimes. If I thought they hadn't done a good job, I would pursue it myself and often end up being the one who was writing the final story about it. This whole, after Marvin was released, the other three were still in prison for a number of years, and protests, marches were just continually happening. This was a huge, big moment in our particular investigation, where Russ Kelly, who was a journalism student here at UAF, he was also my ringer. Russ Kelly was a foreign intelligence officer during, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and so he was a pretty good interrogator. And what this kind of art stuff was my rehabilitation. Taking Charles Mason's digital photography class and sort of getting things out of my system. But there was a movement that grew in town here called Free the Fairbanks Four. And that pretty much cut across the spectrum. It was led by April Monroe, a priest, Father Pat, and just, all sorts of Native organizations. And it just really turned into a movement. Then what happened suddenly, which was great, because at the end of the day, suddenly we had answers. And that was a prison guard in the lower 48 heard another guy, a former Fairbanks resident gangbanger, who had, he and his partner had murdered, I think it was 3 people in a particular, drug, ripoff scheme. And he was being, had a prison guard who talked to him all the time, every day. And he opened up to the prison guard about the other kid they killed first. And that was John Hartman. And that prison guard notified the state of Alaska, and the state of Alaska sat on that letter for 2 years, and, that's the sort of stuff that you can't make up. And it's just so egregious, it's hard to imagine. But this was Wild Bill Holmes, and these are some of the things he said. And we interviewed him, and that was pretty amazing. And the fight continued. with the state not acknowledging what had happened. This is Marvin Roberts. This kid was 4 years old when Marvin Roberts had gone to jail. This is a younger brother. How many folks remember the demonstrations here? It was pretty much, you would have been pretty young, even if you lived in town. But there was lots of ongoing demonstrations. This picture is with Marvin Roberts after he was freed, standing next to my daughter, who is a junior here at UF these days. This picture was taken, she was pretty young, and this case had been in the back of her life, you know, growing up. Anyway, okay, leadership. I really pursued this case in a kind of determined effort. I was working for the university, so I contributed over 50 stories to the Newsminer for free. My students were publishing what they learned through the Sun Star here, and a number of different editors of the Sun Star. How many of you guys actually read the Sun Star these days? Oh, good. I'm glad to see that. I'm really glad to see that. Many of the best students who worked on this were Sun Star either staffers or actual lead editors. And first and foremost, who's ever heard the name Casey Grove? And where do you know him from? Yes, Alaska Public Radio. And Casey Grove was my first student. I literally met him at I think it was a junkyard, you know, or something crazy like that. And he asked who I was because he recognized my name on, what kind of place was it? It was something that he saw my name on a label, and he knew that I worked for the Newsminer. And I told him who I was, and he said, I'm going to be in your class. So that was my first student, Casey Grove. And he proved to be just a really dogged reporter and, really put a lot into this. Now, there was huge opposition, and this is, again, what I would, I'll point to in terms of leadership. The Newsminer, when I proposed this series, them publishing this series, the lawyers at the Newsminer said, why are you doing this? Why are you involved in this? And you're not even working here anymore. Why should we publish your story? And I said, it's an important story, and it's the community cares about it. And you're trying not to be offensive, but like the reporters there weren't up to it, and didn't have the background and hadn't done it justice in the past. And I wanted to settle what was true. And anyway, that was what the lawyers thought. That was a lot of Newsminer reporters thought. Kelly Boston, who was the managing editor, backed me on it. And Kelly Boston is the one who, in leadership, just said, we're going to run it. I don't care if this leads to, angry letters, and I don't care that this is important. This is news. This belongs in the public. So leadership on Kelly's part, certainly the way that I had TV students. Yeah, every class I taught to some extent, other than mass comm, I sort of like involved in this thing for quite a while. And then ultimately we partnered with the Alaska Innocence Project, which was founded with some knowledge of this. And I'll leave you with one last thing to really chew on about this. This case dragged on so many years that you had defenders who were later became prosecutors and vice versa. And you had lawyers that at one time or another represented the floor. And I come from a family with a legal background. I mean, my family is associated with a law firm by my last name in Washington, D.C., O'Donoghue and O'Donoghue. And it's just something I never knew. I knew that I never wanted to be part of. And yet I spent a lot of my career in reporting on legal issues. But the bottom line is, having the guts to stand up to management and insist that it's my shot and I'm going to call it and we're going to publish this thing was a huge mark of, I consider to be leadership on Kelly's part, but also what I used my position as a professor to pursue. I know my students were learning something from doing it, but at the same time, I was chasing my own something that was very important to me. And like I say, I couldn't sit still knowing once we determined they were innocent, in a sense, that was the worst thing that could happen to you personally. Because what are you going to do? You can't walk away from that. You got to do what you can. And we did with an alliance with a lot of people, including the Innocence Project. And yes, the thing I want to leave you thinking about is you guys have all heard of attorney-client privilege, okay, right? Does everyone know what that is? You tell your lawyer something and that is sacrosanct, right? That's not the way it really works. Lawyers talk to each other. Lawyers who are members of the law firm sort of discuss cases together. Lots of information is shared. And in this case, I know there were a lot of people in the legal community in Fairbanks were aware that other guys had confessed. Other guys had confessed, but they believed that doesn't count because it's all under attorney-client privilege. And I think that's a pretty shocking thing that within the law, within the sort of whole circles of this, that information can be shared, and information that innocent people are in jail, but you consider that to be off the table to discuss because you're not supposed to. And attorneys in town have let me know about this. There was one in particular, one of the murderer's attorneys, okay? And I've written about this, and I have a new book coming out about the whole thing called the Fairbanks 4. And a attorney in town who represented Jason Wallace, who was one of the murderers, every time I ran into him, he would just say, keep going, attaboy, keep after that, keep asking questions. And at a certain point, this is odd. This is not normal. This is not the way reporters hear things from lawyers. And at that point, I had never considered he was representing someone in this that had any affiliation with it. Because like I say, it was buried for years that some guys that lived here, but then were in prison for something they'd done in the lower 48, were involved in the Hartman case when they were teenagers. I mean, what a weird, crazy thing, and your life will surprise you that way sometimes. But that was one of them. Okay, am I good on time? Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
So I'm Andrew Kitchenman. I'm the editor of the Alaska Beacon. The Alaska Beacon is a nonprofit news outlet focused on state government, state politics, and state policy. Thank you to Professor Boylan for inviting me. It's an honor to join you. Since I came to Alaska in 2016, every time I've met a graduate of Arctic and Northern Studies, I've been impressed, and I've only visited Fairbanks, but UAF seems to be a special place. So as far as my personal and professional trajectory to get to where I am today. I'm originally from the Philadelphia area and grew up in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania suburbs. I first learned about Alaska in elementary school. I remember the first thing that I think I ever learned about Alaska was ptarmigans, and that has really stuck with me. I don't know why it did, but maybe the spelling and the plumage. And the second thing was that one of my teachers at one point briefly lived in Alaska, and she described having thick curtains when she lived here, and to keep out the light. That also stuck with me. It was a place where people had curtains to keep out the light in the summer. So I grew up in a household where the news was treated as important. And I think that's why I am where I am today. I'm a journalist, is because my parents would talk about what was in the newspaper, and we would watch the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. I worked on my high school and college papers. I was the editor of my college paper, which was the first time I was in a leadership position. I went to a liberal arts college, St. Mary's College of Maryland, a small state college in Maryland, named after the county it's in, St. Mary's County. The school didn't offer any journalism classes. I was an English major, but there were very talented people on the volunteer campus newspaper. And it was inspiring to work with them. And I decided I wanted to do that after college. I worked in different regions of the East Coast for the first couple years after college. I worked at a weekly in Virginia and a small paper in Connecticut. Then I decided to get a master's in journalism, in part because I had never taken a journalism class, and I wanted to have a sense as to what that was all about. I got to go to Columbia University in New York City, and that experience was really helpful for me in terms of understanding the broader world and meeting people from around the world. I lived in an apartment building that was, most of the residents were international graduate students. And I think in a little way, even though I basically stayed on the East Coast my whole life until I moved to Alaska, it inspired me to think about travel and potentially moving to different parts of the world, even though I wound up moving to a different part of the United States. Throughout most of my career, I worked in New Jersey for 13 years. The last 7 of those, I was covering state government, both how the state government affected businesses and public health and healthcare policy. In the middle of all that, in my years in New Jersey, I interviewed to be the Anchorage Daily News's Juneau reporter. And while I didn't get the job, it planted the seed that Juneau would be a cool place to live and work. Years later, I wanted to work in public radio, and I applied to be the public radio state government reporter in Juneau, and I got that job. By the way, if I had gotten the job in 2006, I would have started right around within a couple of weeks of Sarah Palin becoming the governor. So that would have been an interesting experience. But so I kind of followed her from the East Coast before she was globally famous. So in my years in Juneau, I covered the legislature, Governor Walker and Governor Dunleavy. My first year was the first year that the PFD, the permanent fund dividend, was reduced. And my third year was Governor Dunleavy's controversial first budget that included a 43% cut in funding for the university, which wound up not happening, but that was the original proposal. Part of it did happen, and then various things have happened since then, but that was the original proposal. For 7 years, I had a front seat view of Alaska's elected leadership in Juneau. And before that, I had a view of different leaders on the East Coast in New Jersey. Something I'd like to emphasize about my trajectory is that I was always more focused on being a reporter and learning more as a reporter than being a leader. There were 2 reasons for that. One was that being a reporter is fun. You're out talking to people. You're learning new things most days, pretty much every day. And you're helping the community become better informed in a really direct way, where you can see, you put these stories out into the world and you see people react to that, and you hear from people. And I really got a lot of satisfaction from it. The other reason I wasn't thinking of being a leader, or particularly being an editor, which is what leaders are generally in journalism, was that I had seen mid-level managers often feel pressure from multiple directions, both having to manage reporters and then being held responsible when things went wrong. I didn't feel like they were always empowered to have a lot of influence, but they were blamed when things went wrong. Which I would say as a higher lead, if you're ever in a position as a higher up leader, keep that in mind, that you should really have people's responsibilities match what they're held responsible for. But I had thought through the years that if there was an opportunity to become a top leader without having to be a mid-level leader, I might try to do it. But throughout all those years of being a reporter, I've always been a kind of student of watching my editors work and learning from them. So learning about leaders by watching leaders. Let's see. So the Alaska Beacon was started by States Newsroom, which is a national nonprofit. States Newsroom was started in 2018. It had learned from various nonprofits that have been launched over the last 20 years, focused on state government. One thing that a lot of the previous nonprofits had struggled with was funding, and having these journalists start this nonprofit and then find much of their time trying to raise money. And the leadership of States Newsroom got connected with some significant national funders, and through those conversations came up with the idea of a single nonprofit that would launch separate news outlets in states across the country, and allow the journalists there to really focus on journalism. And States Newsroom added about 6 or 7 outlets a year, starting in 2018. The Alaska Beacon was the 27th outlet. We started in January of 2022. Excuse me. They advertised for an editor, which was the first step for the Beacon, in January of 2022. I applied a few weeks later. Luckily, the ad was still open when I applied, and a friend had encouraged me to apply, or to at least consider that. Being the 27th States Newsroom outlet, I got the benefit from the organization's experience from 26 previous launches. And they basically gave me a template with checklists where I was basically empowered to make a lot of important decisions, but I could work off of this list and know the things that needed to get done and the time frame to do it. And that was really helpful. By far the most important part of launching the Beacon was recruitment. The Beacon is a 4-person team. We cover different subject areas, primarily state policy and state politics, but also the economy and the environment. And I picked these beats looking at the other 26 States Newsroom outlets and figuring out what in Alaska makes sense for Alaska. So I'd say an essential piece of Alaska leadership is knowing what's unique about this place. And I don't know if there's another news organization that combined the environment and the economy into a single beat, but I felt like knowing Alaska, that made a lot of sense. I didn't want it to be just energy and the environment, which is frequently a beat in news organizations, because I knew we wanted to cover fishing within that and really, look at the entire economy and how it relates to the environment. And our other beats are education, health, justice, which includes both criminal and social justice. They're not always combined in the same beat, but you could look at an instance like the Fairbanks 4 and perhaps see a reason for thinking in terms of combining them. And I've just been really fortunate that the people I've hired have been just as good or greater than I hope they would be. They're so dedicated. My colleagues are James Brooks in Juneau, who works with our newest addition, Corinne Smith, who joined us 3 months ago. And here in Anchorage, where I work, we also have Yareth Rosen. So what I think makes leadership in Alaska and the Arctic unique or special is, I'm sure what I would have to say is going to overlap with what you've been hearing from other lecturers, but the culture, the geography, how those two relate. Living in Juneau, I would go to the State Museum and they had a heavy emphasis on how the relationship between geography and culture for Alaska Natives, how, you know, the kind of foods that you had available would kind of shape the culture, and the culture could shape the foods. And I think that that's still true for the state. It's still true for Alaska Native cultures. Obviously, I'm not Alaska Native, and I don't have any insight I have is really as an outsider and an observer coming here in my late 30s. But I do have a sense that, and you know, there's more than 20 different cultures, but that particularly when you think of the Arctic, that the emphasis on the community, that you know, if you're going it on your own, you're not going to make it, because you know, the environment is going to kill you. And I think that also led to a kind of egalitarian aspect that perhaps has affected the state more broadly, but certainly I think still has an effect. You know, not completely egalitarian, but an aspect of that, which I think is interesting when you look at it from a leadership point of view, where you're potentially in a hierarchy. I think leadership by example and leadership by listening are things that are valuable here, that have been shaped by the geography and the culture. You know, thinking about the cities of Anchorage and Fairbanks, I think extractive industries have had a big impact on the culture, and that you need enormous outside investment in order to be able to launch these industries. I'm particularly thinking of mining and oil, and that requires, you know, power to often be power and influence to be determining people's lives, to be outside of the state, you know, in terms of, you know, oil companies headquartered in Texas, or the federal government headquartered in Washington, D.C. And I think that creates a kind of, when you're a leader here, you both have to think about the broader world, and you know, if you're a leader within a large, say within a national organization, how you relate to your fellow leaders outside of the state, and how you reflect the values of the state, you know, if you're a part of something larger. I think there's a kind of mix of dependence on these outside forces and independence, you know, which we think of, and the libertarian nature of the culture. And then I would say the coastal culture, in the cities like Juneau, is yet another sort of strain of Alaska culture, that kind of, I would say, kind of West Coast creativity and openness to ideas that was really striking to me coming from here as a lifelong East Coast person. You know, there's the hub and spoke geospatial relationship between villages and rural hubs, and then the rural hubs and the urban centers. And I think that can shape, you know, how a leader thinks about the state. I think risk-taking is absolutely a part of Alaska's culture. I don't know what the source of that is, whether it has to do with the geography, but it's been something that's been really striking to me in getting to know Alaskans and becoming one. And I would say just an example of an Alaska decision I made as a leader was choosing to hire Yareth versus other journalists. Yareth is our economy and environment reporter, as well as our health reporter. And she had been working in the state since 1987, starting at the Anchorage Times, and had really focused on the Arctic. And I knew that the issues there are so unique that it would greatly benefit a state news organization to have a reporter who has a lot of background and understanding of the issues from decades of reporting. What is my leadership style? I place a lot of weight on respecting reporters. I mean, some of this is that we're a kind of profession. We're not a licensed profession, but it's a kind of vocation that requires some degree of knowledge. And, you know, by hiring experienced journalists, I really wanted to empower them. And that goes back to me having more than 20 years as a reporter, before I became a leader. I kind of look at things from a reporter point of view. I've seen different styles of editors. And I think, once you build up or hire reporters who have the skills that you're looking for, you want to set them free. Now, I also know that they need support. And so I try to give them constructive feedback. So while I am delegating quite a bit, I also, want to give them examples. I draw from my own experience. I've been asked, do I like being an editor? Do I like being a manager? And my answer has always been, for the past 3 years, I know I like editing these 3 people, and I know I like managing these 3 people. So I don't know if I like being an editor or a manager. I just know I like my job. And I've had to be a more intensive manager in certain circumstances, like we've had interns. And so I've exercised different skills as a leader in that way. I encourage a culture of participation. And so I am a participative leader in certain ways. We have weekly staff meetings on Google Meet, so like Zoom, and we go over what's worked, what's connecting with readers, what projects we want to work on together, where we want to concentrate our attention. We rely on Slack, the office social media, and that's where reporters share plans. I make sure that we share our plans with each other so that everyone has a chance to give input and feedback. They all have experience and know different sources. And so if they know someone's working on a story, they can offer potential sources for the story. And I guess my basic orientation is towards service, that I see journalism as a public service. And I think that my style as a leader aligns with that, like helping my coworkers so that their skills and experience and talents can best serve the community. As leader in my field, what challenges am I trying to address right now? The immediate challenge for journalists is figuring out how best to cover the impacts of federal changes on Alaska. And we want to go beyond just like reporting on the number of layoffs, but look at what services have been done by the people who are being laid off and that may not be done in the future. Try to tell those stories. And I'm encouraging my coworkers to look for those stories. As a field, you may have heard that the business model of journalism is broken. It relied heavily on advertising, which shifted to the big social media giants. So it used to be a kind of field that was flush with money, and there's hardly any left. It is a focus of philanthropy more. I try to raise funds in Alaska. It's a small part of my job, but it's been really gratifying that Alaskans have made small donations. You could click on a box on our website where we receive donations, and that's really important in our budget and to become a sustainable model over time, and certainly if we're ever going to grow. There's more and more philanthropy focused on journalism, including a national effort that has an Alaska affiliate called the Press Forward Initiative. People are really trying to think, how can we fund journalism? And I want to play a constructive role in that, but it's really not the primary focus. I'm really a journalist thinking of doing reporting first and helping my reporters. Today, March 27th, public media is under threat, and for Alaska, that is particularly meaningful because public radio in Alaska is particularly strong. I believe in the service it provides. It's a political question as to whether the government should fund it, and I just believe in bringing Alaskans the information they need to make informed decisions as they communicate with their legislators. But I certainly am not in a position to say what should happen, because that's not what journalists do. I'm more in a position to think about what information, based on how I understand Alaskans' values, what information they would want to know to understand the world, particularly in terms of state government and to a lesser extent, our three-member delegation. We can directly support public radio by making our content available. I didn't say this when I was describing State's Newsroom and the Alaska Beacon, but something that's unique about us is that we offer all of our content through something called Creative Commons. So we're essentially giving it away. It's a kind of licensing of saying that this says you are free to republish this. We only ask that people give us credit, that if it's online, that it links back to the original story. And so the public radio stations that have strong websites have taken advantage of that. I've also encouraged people to take our stories and rewrite them for radio, to make small adjustments so that you could read them on the air. That often just means taking the very top of the story. A big challenge for journalism in Alaska is that we failed in many ways historically. There are groups that have been underrepresented in journalism in Alaska, and so I try to think of ways of addressing that, of including a wider range of voices in our journalism and valuing the perspectives of people who are not empowered in our society, people who maybe aren't considered leaders. Because we are going to, as journalists, sort of naturally cover leaders because they have power and influence, elected officials. That's sort of core of our job, but we can't forget the broader public. I'd really like to have a reporter focused on Indigenous affairs, and I'm speaking to you during a frustrating week because I was offered about 1/3 of the funding for a position to do that this week, and I had until tomorrow. It's like a movie plot. I had until tomorrow to come up with the rest of the money, and unfortunately, if it was a movie, I would have come up with the money, and unfortunately, that hasn't happened. So I'm not going to be able to get this additional funding to have a new position, but just shows the kind of constraints we're working within. It can be uncomfortable to be in the truth business when you see people who gain power gain it by sometimes not being truthful. And I'm not really singling out things. I think this would be true at any time. But I also, at the same time, I don't want to come across as being certain of myself, of being smug or self-righteous. I'm not saying I'm naturally these things. It's just that in this world in which we're pursuing the truth, and we have to cover politicians who sometimes say things that are not truthful. Something that seems to really be driving a lot of what's happening is a sense of resentment that there are people who perceive themselves as being smarter or more ethical or something. And so I really try to always check myself that people have all sorts of different perspectives on these things. The last question is what advice would I give others who are interested in becoming leaders in Alaska and the Arctic? And I would say, there are opportunities here. That's an exciting part about this place, is that because of the small population size, there are more leadership opportunities than in many other places. I think learning about what makes this place unique, like you are by taking this lecture series, is really important. I think that the biggest resource anywhere is human beings. And we don't have many of them in Alaska compared to many other places, but the ones who are here know this place, they know the land and the culture, and better than anyone else. And the more you know about these things, I think the better position you are to become a leader. Learning about climate change, not just causes, and what's being done in response to it, but what those who are thinking about the future and looking to the future are thinking about it. I just always, in the politicians who I admire, or I don't really admire, I don't know if admire is not the right word for how I view politicians, but something that I look for is being honest, showing integrity, being willing to admit when you've made a mistake, being open to learning, and being open to changing your mind. And that's an interesting combination because, having integrity often means like not just blowing with the wind, but I think striking that balance of having it and being open to being flexible is important. I would encourage anyone who's ever thought about journalism to think about it. In the news, the pay is poor and the prospects are challenging, but the satisfaction is phenomenal, and the importance of having people in our society be well informed is no less important or valuable than ever, even if the same number of dollars don't flow to it. And that's what I have to say.
Any questions?
And what do you suggest in this day and age with the lack of funds to get into investigatory work like that?
Well, I think that particular model in universities could work a lot of places. You know, I mean, you find out what students care about. You find out what they're kind of interested in. We did a lot of big things like this ongoing Hartman case, but plenty of students investigated things that matter to them. And all of that sort of is self-sustaining, you know, I mean, it was a great sort of thing, I thought. The nonprofit model is really important. And we need to get organizations that help, you know, dig into questions that people have and share the answers.
So after the pandemic.
Yeah.
How have people seen media shift? Do you feel people read as before, or will news outlets become extinct? I'm also from New Jersey.
Yeah. I'm very concerned about the flood of information that is not verified by someone, by an organization that doesn't have an agenda. And traditionally, the press was an organization to get answers to things people were curious about or would be interested in or need to know. We can't really trust that in the online chaos of trying to identify what organization has any credibility right now. And I just think as consumers of information, you really should ask a lot of questions about what is the source of information and what is the chances of the information I'm getting from this particular source that it's unbiased. And I don't think there's very many things that we can trust right now. I mean, even recently, there's indications that Apple is bowing somewhat, or Microsoft is bowing to the government's sort of mandates about, you know, referring to gender, other things like that. I mean, it's a scary time. Let me just say the nonprofit model that you know, Kitchenman is talking about is incredibly important. You know, these are folks that are motivated to do a good job, and these type of organizations are among the few that you can really hopefully trust. You know, but again, the traditional model of journalism, I feel is really teetering at best, and staffing is gutted compared to what it was. And almost every organization staffing is really gutted, especially smaller town publications like us, as opposed to the Washington Post or the New York Times. There's a handful of really strong organizations now, but not many.
Brian, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you've done a lot of legal journalism, and I just wonder if there's comparable cases or any other like famous cases in Alaska where your style of journalism has led to
Results?
You know, are there led to vindication for innocent people or other ways that comparable cases where journalism has led to sort of redemption for people across the state?
They do exist. You know, I mean, I'm trying to think right at the moment about specifics. Anchorage Daily News was very good for many years. In pursuing all sorts of stories. You know, lately, there's been some good reporting on some of the Iditarod decisions, recently that I think were pretty outrageous and disqualifying people and such. On an ongoing basis, you see every paper is putting out some good stuff. Every traditional paper is putting out some good stuff on a regular basis, but it's just it's such stress and I mean, like I say, that the Newsminer at one point when I worked there had a newsroom of 30, and now if the newsroom has 6 on a good day, and that just reduces your ability to collect information, and this is all over the country. We're seeing reporting organizations that are struggling.
If you had any comments on the closure of KTVF.
Well, I work for KTVF. It's heartbreaking. I mean, we have, I believe, one of my former students is based here as a reporter for I think it's KTVF, but he feeds to Anchorage, and that's one person doing what. When I worked for KTVF, we had at least 5 reporters. TV's always been shorter staffed and had a set amount of time and how many stories can you fit compared to how many stories you have in a newspaper. And when I worked at KPTF, I think we had 5 full-time reporters, and we supplied information to the Anchorage fellow station as well, but we were not doing the kind of level of reporting that the newspapers were, for sure. It was fun. I liked TV for a little while. I was a broadcast TV major at NYU, and that was to learn something different, because I had been a reporter.
So I'm a 37-year-old father of 3, and I failed at lots of bachelor's attempts, and this is my current target is a Bachelor of Journalism.
Okay.
Can you tell me why this is what I should pursue and do when I finish growing up?
Well, you got to do it because it's a compelling, something you love, and yeah, I better not hit that. You got to have a sense of mission, okay? And that's really important, and I think every good reporter has that. Sometimes it embraces a broad field. Sometimes it's very, very narrow, but I think that I found it to be rewarding throughout. Financially, right now, it's a little bit dicey. These nonprofits that are, with a mandate to find important news and share it, might be the thing to really look at, and the Beacon is one of many around the country that that nonprofit model is probably the kind of home that you'd be looking for. Okay. Now, the other advice I would give you is develop some specific areas of expertise. What is it that you would be really motivated to dig into, as opposed to just walking in and asking the boss, what should I work on today? I mean, you want to come up with your own, okay, this is an old thing. It's better to have your own ideas of what you think is important to go look into than wait for the editor to hand you an assignment. Because a lot of the assignments you're handed, I want to be kind, are something that somebody's bugged the editor to get someone to do that isn't necessarily something in your whole frame of mind is worth it. And we all do a lot of those stories too.
After the pandemic, how have you seen media shift? Do you feel people read as before, or will news outlets become extinct? I mean, there's just been a general decline in the news media over the last 20 years. There was a much more rapid decline after the global financial crisis in 2008 or so than there was during the pandemic. During the pandemic, there was an enormous amount of interest in the news. I covered ANZINC and the state's response, and probably covered more of those evening news conferences. I probably spent as much time watching those evening news conferences as any Alaskan, because I covered all of them. I just took that on. And there was that was an experience that reinforced the value of the media, because people were really interested. It was really important, sort of seemed like life-changing news, and getting the information out. Now, as the pandemic evolved, people's view of the news and of scientific information changed quite a bit, and that was its own issue. As far as do people read as before? I mean, before the pandemic, I don't know. I mean, I think like I said, I really think that these changes have been consistent over time. So certainly people don't consume the news in the same way they did in the 90s, but I didn't see a real rapid change during the pandemic. Do I think news outlets will become, well, many news outlets have already become extinct, and many that currently exist will become extinct. I'm sure of that. But I think there'll still be news outlets in the future. And there are things that aren't really outlets that are growing. Substack is growing. That's paid email newsletters, often done by individuals. We republish, the Beacon republishes all the content from a Substack called Northern Journal, that's produced by Nathaniel Hers, who's a former journalist for the Alaska Public Media and for the Anchorage Daily News. And he works with another writer who covers mining. And that's a growth area. I think philanthropy is growing. I think certain people are understanding that to have news, you have to pay for it. So whether that's through donations or through subscriptions, whether it's being a member of a public radio station or buying your local newspaper or making a donation to an organization like the Alaska Beacon, really think about that. And honestly, you may not know what's being paid for by philanthropy, but be willing to pay for your news, because you get what you pay for. And there's this old line that if you're not paying for the product, then you're the product, like you're what's being sold. And I think, I think, like Brian said, learning how to assess the media and figuring out which sources to rely on is really important. Abby Charles asked, you said that being in the truth business can be uncomfortable when you're dealing with people who gain power by being untruthful. That's basically what I said. What are some techniques you use to get your interview subjects to tell you the truth? Well, I mean, it helps to have knowledge going into an interview so that it really depends on the story. There are stories where you know a lot about the subject as a reporter, and so it helps to be as prepared as possible so that you can sort of fact check in real time and sort of know what areas to ask follow-up questions. I mean, when I say not being truthful, I mean there's an extreme end of someone knowing they're not being truthful. There's someone who's just sort of saying what's in their self-interest, whether it's true or not. And then there's just degrees of people. Sometimes are forgetful. There's a big motivation for people to believe what's in their own self-interest, regardless of whether it's true or not. And these are just things to be aware of when you're asking questions. But I think, sometimes it calls for confrontation, but I don't have a super confrontational personality. And often you can go very far by basically trying to give people room, to be truthful, present truthful information. And if they're not being truthful, on the spot, maybe ask like, oh, I thought it was this other thing. I mean, it's a little bit different when you're on broadcast. Interviews are different than interviews for print, because you don't have to worry about how you sound or how quick their answer is. But those are some things. the incoming editor of the Sun-Star says, we heard you talk about Beacon weekly meetings. Could you flesh out what they look like a bit? What do you focus on to develop stories individually and as a newsroom? How do you choose which stories to focus on when there's so many? I mean, that's it, there are so many, so it's hard to generalize where we get them. You know, in covering the government, during the legislative session, our reporters are looking at the daily schedule of meetings in Juneau in the Capitol and deciding which bills are being, looking at which bills are going to be discussed and decide, that it helps to know about the bills and know what the bills do and to know, are they controversial? Are they going to have a big impact on people's lives? I really care about the effect, what makes a real difference in people's lives. Sometimes that isn't always exactly what people care about the most. People who care about politics tend to really care about partisan success. And, you can make a living as a journalist doing nothing but telling people which political party's up and which political party's down every day, because there's an immense thirst for that. I don't really care about that. I mean, it matters, but I only care about it insofar as it matters. People approach politics sometimes like they approach sports teams, and you can feed into that. That's not really what drives me. I think relying on the reporters, they've been covering the areas. So the longer you cover something, the more informed you are, and the easier it is for you to sort through all of the potential stories you can be covering. So there's different elements of news. Is it new? I joke sometimes we don't cover it. We're not in the olds business. We're not covering the olds. So is it new? It doesn't have a big impact on people's lives. Is it controversial? People say the news is too negative. I mean, one thing is that if you do a lot of positive stories, people tend to tune out. So what people say isn't always like matched by their behavior, unfortunately. I like covering positive news stories, and I encourage people to look for, because we're covering policy, tough stuff tends to be really heavy. And so it's great when opportunities arise to do lighter stories or even stories that are on serious subjects, but aren't necessarily policy focused. Like Yareth did a story recently about winter sports and how climate change is affecting winter sports. And that was a really interesting story. Yeah. As an editor, I rely a lot on my reporters. Our new reporter, Corinne, she's new to her beats. So I'm really spending more time with her, helping her think through. And I talk about how I think through stories, things like how many people are affected by the story, things I've been mentioning in the last minute or so. I talk about with her. Why do you think the money disappeared in the industry? Is there a way to recover? The money just moved because the way Google and Facebook work is if you're an advertiser, you can speak directly to the person you're advertising to through that. Newspapers were really scattershot away. It was like, yeah, most people in a community might subscribe to the paper and they might page through it every day. But, one reason why people used to page through the paper is because they were looking for ads. And so you knew as an advertiser, that was basically all, that was the only game in town. So it really doesn't have anything to do with journalism. Sort of what was funding journalism didn't have much to do with journalism. What killed what killed the funding for journalism doesn't have anything to do with journalism. I would love to see a couple of the people like Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page or Sergey Brin, who made their fortune off of the money that had previously all gone to funding journalism. I'd love to see them, perhaps when they pass on, put some of their vast fortunes toward funding democracy and informed democracy through journalism. So I think, some people recognize the importance of having an informed public. A frustrating part for journalism is like, once you care about politics, then you probably want certain political outcomes, and that's not my job to help with that. And so people both want sort of propaganda that serves the interest of the politics that they want to see, and they want the truth, and the two are two different things. And people like to think that everything that supports their political ideas is true, but the further you get on that path and you say, well, I'm going to support a certain politician no matter what they do because I believe in them, well, then you've given them license to do whatever they want and say whatever they want. Yeah, is there a way to recover? I think philanthropy, people choosing factual information. I think everyone's awash in false information. Everyone kind of knows it, or many people know it. And the more you recognize that, the more you might see that in addition to paying for your monthly internet bill, you might also pay for news. How do you decide how to frame a story on balance, neutrality versus truth? Yeah, I mean, we're in the truth business. So, if people in politics provide base what they're saying on facts, then that's really helpful. Looking at factual information is really important. You could say, there's a billion facts. How do we choose the facts? It's knowing the community. It's the feedback you get from the community. Knowing the community's values. I think I've always tried to be fair to different points of view. I've never seen my job as to give equal space to someone who's telling the truth and someone who's lying. But if it's not as clear cut as that, I think in a democracy, it's helpful to hear more than one point of view. So I really try to do a good job of representing conflicting points of view. And sometimes I almost feel like I used to joke that I'm channeling people when I'm typing their quotes, because I'm trying to understand the world through their eyes, and that's not possible. But it's part of being a journalist, at least for me, is trying to do the best I can. What's your advice to small newspapers covering those topics that mainstream papers don't? It's an interesting piece of it, because the Beacon doesn't have to cover everything the same way. If I know that the ADN is going to cover something, or the Fairbanks News Miner is going to cover something, we might think of giving people perspective, or giving people different perspectives, or trying to look at things from a different way. Or if it's a breaking news story and people are reacting to, say, when Typhoon Merbok hit Nome, like our first story was really about policy implications. How are people going to think about policy for the future? I think knowing your audience is really important. So if you've identified an audience that's not being served by the existing news that's in your community, then you're covering the things that audience cares about that aren't being covered. I think is a good place to start. As a 37-year-old father of 3 on his 4th degree change, why should I pursue this as what I do when I finish growing up? Well, as a rational calculation, as like what the future prospects are, I'd encourage you, like the Bureau of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor puts out, projections of future growth or future pay growth for different fields. And I can tell you, for reporters, there is not future growth projected, and that the pay has been really stagnant for a really long time, and in inflation adjusted terms has fallen quite a bit. I just would argue that there's more to life than money, and if you have any space at all to explore something, and you care about your community, helping people become, getting good at helping people become more informed is very socially valuable, and you really see the consequences of that. You get this feedback, and so sometimes you see policy changes. The ADN, the Anchorage Daily News story, did a story today on, I think it was today, on how the court system has a new rule to handle trials faster because of a series that the ADN did. I mean, the court system didn't say that, but if you saw the work that the ADN did late last year, you would know, or January. I'm trying to remember the time frame. I think some of it came out in January. you see these direct consequences that I feel is making the world a better place. So I think in Alaska, it's a little more encouraging because there are still more not necessarily thriving news organizations in the state, but viable news organizations in the state that are still productively reporting on the news in Alaska that still exist, that are still hiring. So if you want to be a journalist, Alaska is a place where you can still do it, and that's not true everywhere. So the question is, you keep hearing all the time that if you want news, you have to pay for it, even though I subscribe to multiple news sources, and I am wondering if you can speak to why there isn't an industry standard to pay for one article you want versus having to take a full subscription. Some publications allow it. I think different organizations sort of tested that and found that people weren't really taking them up on it. There are still sites, I think certain newspaper sites where you do that. Beacon's free, so all of our stuff you could read for free. You don't have to worry about it. As to why there aren't more industry standards, I think historically all the news organizations, even if they weren't competing in the same city, they were sort of competing nationally for stock for investments, and so they were each one trying to sort of outdo the others. I think, in terms of like standard amounts, it's certain news organizations are much more expensive to run than others. The New York Times spends probably more on news than, any other news organization other than a couple. Maybe Bloomberg probably spends the most on news, and Bloomberg is enormously expensive to access their content. While there's Substacks where if a person can get 10,000 people to give them $5, then they can halfway almost make a living. My position on ethnic media, it's great. I think that they have been just as challenged as any other form of media by the economic wins. I think the Spanish language paper here in Anchorage is doing good work. As far as I can tell, I can't read Spanish. There's a new Korean language paper in Anchorage that is doing, is trying to serve its community. And so I'm happy to see that in Alaska, and I hope there's more of it. KYUK does some broadcasts in Yupik. I think I hope to see more of it. So yeah, thank you for founding the paper.